Hi guys, in this video I'm going to be showing you how I prepare my sketchbook to hold oil paints, and then specifically what my thought process and method is of going about and doing these master study paintings. Sketchbooks that are specifically prepared for painting are often very expensive and very limiting in the variety and ability that they have to offer. And it's actually very easy and simple and straightforward to prepare your own paper to paint with oils on. And you can do this with any mixed media paper. I generally think that the thicker the better, because you will be applying layers of gesso over on top of it. And if it's a really thin paper to begin with, it's more susceptible to cracking and you don't have anything to really build it on. So I like to use mixed media paper or something that's kind of thicker and heavier and more durable to begin with, even before you start altering it to hold the paint. The reason why you need to apply a primer or some type of protective film over that paper before you can work with oil is if you don't do that, the oil will just kind of seep into the paper and it won't spread and it won't have any of those properties that oil painting has this unique and amazing ability to do, because it's just sinking into the paper and it will corrode it and ruin it over time. In addition to it being a very unpleasant experience, you can pretty much prepare any surface to paint with oil if you have the right method of going about it. And it's actually very simple. All you have to do is I like to use an acrylic gesso when I'm doing a sketchbook because it dries within like 15 minutes at the most. And I always do 2 layers of this acrylic gesso. And the reason I do that is because if you're going a first pass through it, there's always a possibility that there can be a little spot you missed or it not built up enough that oil can still penetrate through and get to that paper, which will ultimately ruin your painting. By doing a second layer, you're giving yourself the second opportunity to catch any of those little spots that you might have missed, in addition to building up a second layer for extra protection. And I do think that acrylic gesso is one of the really important art supplies to get a high quality version of, because I've tried really cheap acrylic gessos in the past and they don't even do half of what they say they're supposed to do. And I've used reasonably priced to slightly on the more expensive side of acrylic gessos, and they are way worth every cent spent on it. I mean, those cheap stuff have to be diluted insane to be as poor quality as they can be. And so I really suggest getting a name brand acrylic gesso, because you can get a little container of that and that stuff will last you sketchbook after sketchbook. I haven't bought an acrylic gesso since I first got it, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I mean, it all depends on how much you use it, but it's a lot of stuff for a reasonable amount of money. Before I really start diving into painting, I use just the raw umber and a lot of odorless mineral spirits to make it nice and thin, and I'm just kind of going back over the drawing that I covered with the gesso in the previous stage. And I'm doing this to bring out the drawing that is pretty hard to see now and would be near invisible once I start applying some of the pigments down. And so I'm doing this with just raw umber because it's a very neutral tone and it leans more toward the warmer side, which is congruent with skin tone. And I'm also paying really close attention to the shadow edge and the line quality between the shadow and the light, and really seeing what that line is doing, because it ultimately distinguishes a lot of what the form, or all of what the form is. And a soft transition really gives the feeling of a slow, gradual transition, a subtle plane change, whereas a really, really sharp one, much like in the nose, when it shows that the form is turning at a really intense and fast rate, opposed to that of the cheek or of a different area of the features. I'm able to go back and make changes with the proportion and line quality in a very easy and simple way, much of like what I was doing with the drawing. I don't have to worry about color and tone and relating things correctly in that aspect with each other yet, so this is a perfect time to go back and really hone in on the proportions before I get into applying paint. Now that I have the proportions in the drawing reading really well and I feel like I have something really solid to build off of, I can start entering the next stage, which is the dead coloring stage. Now, the dead coloring stage got its name from the Renaissance painters, and they use this method to do their figure and portraits. And the dead coloring stage, you would use a very limited range of color because it was a secondary component, the first being that of getting an accurate tonal representation of the model you're doing. And by having color be secondary and suppressed in this early stage, it gave the impression of the figures and portraits of a lack of blood flowing to the face, because there was a lack of color and a lack of saturation, and this was something that would look like in a dead body or a dead portrait. And so the dead coloring stage was signaled kind of a lack of color in the portrait, because it's really just a setup for the next a couple stages. I'm painting in an indirect method, which means that unlike the alla prima method, which is one homogeneous layer of paint that's applied wet on wet, the start to the finish of the piece is just one continual layer. The indirect method, or of way of painting, is several layers of paint that each layer that is built upon it is setting it up for the next layer of paint. So each purpose for a different layer serves as a foundation, as a structure for the next. And so what I'm paying attention to in this dead coloring stage is tone, and in the next stage I'll be focusing on a more complex topic of the painting, and it will keep getting more and more complex. What I'm doing is I'm focusing on the structure and the drawing always, and I'm building up from that layer after layer. And so it's important to know what is the purpose of the layer you're working on if you're working in this method. And for the dead coloring stage, which is what I'm in now, the purpose is just to find tonal harmony and kind of block in some regional colors, but not be too focused on finding those minute variations between the color and the turn of the form. Nothing I say is completely infallible, but one rule of thumb I really like to do in my paintings is, specifically regarding the portrait or the face, is to work light from dark. And this gives me the ability to work on turning the form and placing those correct value tones in the lights before working into the darks, and this allows the transition between the shadow line to be a little more gradual and natural. When I am working with the face, I generally like to start with the forehead because it's a slightly less significant area, and so when I'm getting into the zone or warming up, so to say, for blocking in the face, it's nice to not start with something as complex as the eye, but something a little more straightforward and simple like the forehead. And I like to do this area of the face in the next stage because there's also, foreheads tend to be a little bit more on the yellowish side, so there's less color variation between the forehead because there's not a whole lot of blood flow, and so it gives it a good starting spot, or gives me a good starting spot to start rendering the face from. So as you can see, I'm going back to the forehead, which means I've completed the blocking stage and I'm moving on to the next stage. And so after this dead coloring stage, I'm moving on to the first pass of painting. And this is when I really start feeling like I'm painting a picture and I'm really starting to turn the form. And I'm paying a lot closer attention to more subtle changes and gradations between the forms, and we're looking carefully on how they connect with one another, because that's all a painting is a series of planes and forms that are connecting with one another, and it's through those connections that we get the illusion of light. If you notice in this time-lapse, I am moving at a much slower pace in regards to me moving around the painting. And so in the blocking stage, I worked pretty fast, not staying in any area for too long. And in this stage, I'm really starting to dive into the form and getting it to turn, which was something that I restricted myself from doing in the last stage in order to have a better sense of unity. And I'm also paying more attention to color tones now. And so I am putting in a background that reads a little bit more green, which is consequently going to make the feather in his hat read more red. And so that's one of the ways that I can achieve more accurate color representation, or more elaborate color representation, using a limited palette. One absolute I can say, though, that will drastically improve your painting if it's something that you've neglected like me before I realized how important it was. In regards to the shadow, and any shadow, but specifically in a portrait, the darkest area of the shadow is never in the center of the shadow. Shadows are not uniform in value once you really start looking into them. the darkest dark of the shadow is right at the contour, at the edge of the shadow. And this is because the reflected light doesn't hit that farthest point. And once you start getting into the shadow, you start getting a reflected light from the area around you. And so it's also important to pay attention to what's being reflected, because if there's a warm object being reflected, the area of the shadow is going to read more warmer than that if there was something really cool being reflected. And so if you really start to see the darkest darks of the shadow and figure out where that line is and making that pretty specific, you can really figure out the form by just a single line of the shadow if it's accurately placed. It's important to know what bad habits you have going into a painting so you can actively work on countering them. For me, I know that in the lights, I tend to have the habit of pushing the lights too far because I don't relate them properly with the darks. And so if the darks aren't dark enough, you're going to have to go way too light in order to make the value difference between the two equal to that of the reference. And so one way that I counteract that is I constantly check the brightest brights by taking the paint that I'm going to be applying there and putting a little swab on my reference and comparing the two, because you'd be surprised at how if your darks aren't dark enough, all your tones and colors can feel completely out of context from reality. And so I always like to at least do a check for the darks, one for the dark and one for the light, to really make sure that I am finding all those values that fall in between them correctly. Now, this isn't the dead stage anymore, which means that we have to make sure that the portrait feels alive. One of the best ways that I go about to find this is to check the eyes, nose, and mouth and make sure that there's enough warmth in it. Now, the eyes, nose, and mouth have a lot of blood that goes to it, and there's a lot of areas where there's thin areas of skin or muscle where when light hits it, can make it slightly translucent and will make it more red because you can start to see the blood that's underneath it. I'm going through the eye and I'm really starting to pay attention to how it's warmer and how it's relating warmer and more red than that of the forehead. So the forehead is generally, as a rule of thumb, more yellowish, and then the eyes generally have a more reddish complexion to them. And then the nose, I find that in this reference, it kind of has this gradation from that of the light, which is a little more yellow and washed out. And then as it starts to turn into the darks, it really starts getting red. And then in the darks, it's almost like a really, really dark crimson red, as it's like the blood sitting in the shadow of the face, and it having indications of these more redder areas of the face will really give a more naturalistic and living perspective. Now I'm really starting to get into the armor, and metal is fun because it has a very unique property, and that is that it is highly reflective. And so this means that it's going to take on the colors of the environment that's around it. And so I'm paying close attention to the area of the armor on the left and how it carries some of the colors from the background and has some more warmer notes than that of the armor as it starts to transition into the right. Paying close attention to this will give that reflective property to metal because it's taking on the environment that's around it. Now that I've finished up this stage, I'm going to let the painting dry overnight, and what you'll find the next day is once the painting is dry, at least touch dry, it'll be really matte and sunken in. And this is because the oil will actually sink into the page and the pigments will be left behind. It will look really matte, almost like the pigments themselves. And so to combat this, I'm going to oil in to prepare for the final stage, which is going to be a more transparent and translucent stage. So I'm just using straight walnut oil and making it really thin. So you can see that this is before and after applying only walnut oil. It makes a huge difference to be able to see the colors for what they actually are. Now, I had a really bad filming day today, and in addition to some of my equipment getting broken, the exposure failed to lock on my camera, and so I had to botch a bunch of the footage. But I cut that out, and so this is a couple hours later. I've already kind of got an established glaze around the face, and I'm just kind of working on the face today. With this thin layer of walnut oil that I've already have over the entirety of the painting, I'm able to build onto it and create a more translucent effect. I'm not going to be working too much with drawing, because with the translucency of the paint, it's going to show through the drawing underneath. So I don't want to make these large changes this late onto the drawing. That's what the earlier stages were for. And so I'm really just trying to pay attention to the different colors and how they relate to each other. It is only now that I begin to pull out some specific details and indications of hairs that I break away from the group. And I only do this in a few specific areas that I want to pop, but you only need a couple indications of a specific hair to give an illusion of that whole area is covered with hair. The only area left to bring up to speed is that of the armor, and I'm going back over and glazing the whole area, making the darks darker and really finding that darkest dark within the shadow area. I'm also paying attention to how the colors are working in the darks and how there can be a little nuance and some very subtle color reflections. I'm really diving in to get to the final result. This will be the last pass that I go over with the armor. The last thing I do in a painting is apply a very bold and thick mark of where the brightest bright is, and this will really bump that hierarchy of the brightest bright and the darkest dark, giving a final boost to the 3D appearance. Thank you for watching this video, and if you have any questions or comments that you would like to ask me, be sure to leave them below so I can answer them. And as always, please make sure to subscribe to see more content and help support me in my journey.